right, we're going to kick into a conversation I'm really excited about. I've been looking forward to this all day, and it is around financing and scaling global clean energy. It's another one where we're going to invite you to direct the conversation however you might like. So I encourage you to jump into Slido at any point in the conversation, and feel free to submit your questions or upvote other people's questions depending on what you're interested in hearing about. But to do that, I've got to invite some panelists out, so you've got a sense of who we've got here to pick the brains of. So rejoining me on stage, Kirsty Gogan and Ashish Sethia, and joining them on our panel, Dan Balaban, award-winning Calgarian entrepreneur who currently leads the Greengate team, which is focused on the development of large-scale renewable energy and next-gen net zero projects. And Evan Siddle, CEO of AIMCo, an Alberta Crown corporation that invests on behalf of 32 pension fund and endowment clients. Can you join me in welcoming my panel? Hello, hello. Ashish, I think I was ready for a lot of things at this conference, but I wasn't ready for a discussion of global energy finance that was sketched to Bryan Adams' song lyrics. I don't know about everyone in this audience. I particularly loved when you sang, so that was excellent. No, thank you for that overview, though. In all seriousness, it was really interesting both seeing the level of progress, but also the areas where we've got some real challenges around, investment lagging, and just the scale, I think, of what we're facing into. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. Where to start? Dan, I might start with you, actually. You're someone who, your projects represent about $2 billion of investment. You've got a really interesting portfolio of things that you're working on with a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 1.7 million tonnes per year. You're already doing that, aren't you? I wanted to ask you, before we get into a conversation around kind of the macro, I'd love to focus on the micro experience in terms of the individual entrepreneur facing into this challenge. How have you found raising and getting finance for your business and your projects?
Short answer is it's not easy. Not easy at all. We've been developing renewable energy projects mostly with our focus here on Alberta for more than 15 years. Like you said, over $2 billion of capital we've been able to raise. What I'd say is there's an enormous amount of capital in the world available to be deployed in well-constructed deals, like deals that have really strong commercial underpinnings, with very little technology risk, very little permitting risk, with usually with a long-term offtake. Sounds easy, but it's really difficult to get all that to line up. But we've been able to do it multiple times successfully, and I'd say with a lot of hard work and persistence, there's lots that can be done.
Evan, you've got a really interesting, vantage point and role in this ecosystem, right? Investing on behalf of pension funds. I'm interested to get your take. One of the things that we've touched on a little bit in this morning's panel conversation is some of the tension that can exist between very long-term goals, 2030, 2050, and the reality of short-term returns. I'm interested for your take on the role of the more patient capital that you work in, and just how you're leaning into that strategic opportunity and challenge.
There's a real momentum under that going on right now. The number of funds have started that consist of long-term money, and we're doing some work in this area ourselves at AIMCo. Public markets are pretty fickle, and they want immediate return. Private capital, pension funds, endowment funds, are naturally drawn to this transition finance area because there's long-term money to be made. We don't need current income. We're trying to match long-term commitments, long-term liabilities. And so pension funds and endowment funds and some wealthy individuals are piling into this space in a significant way. But as Dan says, it's very discriminating money.
And you're bullish, a bit similar to what we heard from Derek this morning around the role of the greater green part of the ecosystem. Yeah. Can you explain why that's a focus for you?
That's where we're spending our time at AIMCo. So if you think about, and she said this, in order to achieve net zero, everything has to decarbonize in a way. And some of that's in technology. There's a lot of money that's going into technology right now for well-organized companies. A lot of money going into renewables as well. And AIMCo, as a matter of fact, sold a business on behalf of our clients called Eolia for a massive return because of the demand for renewables. That's kind of the supply side. The demand side of the equation is a little less there's more opportunity there, we think, and it's got to be part of the program. Heavy emitters and the oil and gas business in particular are huge consumers of consumption, and that, we think, helping these companies go from gray to green is the next big area that there's an opportunity for great investment returns in.
Ashish, I want to ask you about, we've touched a little bit on the macroeconomic environment this morning. We're in certainly a high interest rate period. What do you think that will do, if anything, in this space?
It's a very interesting question because interest rates are a huge component of the cost of a renewable energy project. If you compare renewable energy with thermal power generation, like coal or gas power generation, a huge amount of the cost of those projects on a day-to-day basis is fuel. As renewables don't have that, but a huge part of the cost of a renewable project is financing cost, right? Over the years, we have seen that banks have become much more efficient in financing renewable energy projects. And the spread between the base cost of debt or interest rates and the actual cost of debt for a renewable energy project has declined over the years because bankers have become more comfortable with the technology and how it works and the business models as well. But a rise in interest rate does hurt renewable energy projects a fair bit. The only good news is the competition is hurting a lot more because fuel prices are going through the roof, as we discussed in the morning today.
Kirsty, we were talking backstage, and you were talking about some research around the $70 trillion problem. Can you expand a little bit on what we're talking about there? What do we mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting hearing about, the greater green idea and, this idea that we use currently 100 million barrels of oil per day, and we need to decarbonize that energy use. Now, we're going to electrify a lot, but we're not going to be able to electrify everything. We can't easily electrify industry and heat and heavy transport. So ideally, we need drop-in substitute fuels. Now, if we were to try to entirely replace the 100 million barrels of oil per day that we currently use, the oil industry is already expecting to spend, about $24 trillion over the next 30 years just to maintain that current flow of oil and gas. If we were to try to replace all of that with hydrogen-based fuels made from renewables, the cost would be around $70 trillion. Now that is, a huge amount, and that's, because of the capacity factors with renewables and the need to, radically overbuild the system, even with really cheap renewables. And this is making assumptions about, very low-cost renewables and high capacity factors of combined wind and solar. Even then, $70 trillion. If we were to try to do that instead using advanced heat sources that are manufactured in high productivity environments, we would expect the cost of replacing that flow of oil and gas to be closer to 18 trillion. Now, my 7-year-old, when I told him this over a lunch, because, I'm really fun
You're
parent.
how old?
My 7-year-old.
I was like, I did hear
this
7 then, right?
to him, and he said,
That's a heavy lunch conversation.
He said, you mean it would be cheaper to save the world than to destroy it? And I was like,
that's
wow.
some 7-year-old wisdom. That's interesting.
He loves that when I quote him on that.
It is astounding, though. I mean,
Is there enough capital in the world?
that is my question to all of you. Is really
To
when
do what we need to
Ashish,
do.
when we hear your numbers, when I hear you talk about that, Kirsty, I do sit there and go, wow, are we capable of mobilizing the amount of capital
scale
required?
of what we have to do, and we're constantly focusing on the electricity sector, but the other 80% of energy use is huge.
Ashish, you want to go, and then I'll come to you, Evan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another layer of detail here, which is when we ran the numbers last year looking at how much investment is going into energy transition already, and I said $755 billion, the leader in the pack is China as a country, and Bruno talked about this today afternoon as well. Convert that number to GDP, or percentage of GDP, that's 1.5%. How much is the UK spending for the energy crisis this year? 5% of their GDP. So I totally agree with her when she says that it will cost a lot to do something, but the cost of doing nothing is way, way more higher.
Evan?
Yeah, I look at this a little differently. The dialogue is a lot about getting rid of oil or keeping oil, and oil and gas, hydrocarbons. This is a net zero conversation. And the world is continuing to consume more and more energy. I don't think net zero means no hydrocarbons. I mean, if we make the net bigger, then the gross of of hydrocarbons can be tolerated. So, you got to look at this a little bit differently. And the orientation in the pension fund and the investment business has largely been around divestment. Get net zero, get rid of these heavy emitters in your portfolio. I think that has a few problems with it. Number one, what we're going to do is we're going to starve the companies of capital that most need it. Two, we're going to drive them into the hands of unsavory owners, regimes, or people who are just trying to milk it for money. And third, it's a short on human ingenuity. There's a lot of know-how in this town, in the hydrocarbon industry, that really understands net zero and wants their business to survive. And we can help them by funding them. But it's with a view towards decarbonizing, sure.
Kirsty, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that firstly, we ideally want to leverage the skills, capability, and assets of the oil and gas sector by producing drop-in substitute fuels that can be stored and distributed and used in existing end-use infrastructure. Mm-hmm. We want to leverage the already operating at global scale, infrastructure that we have. But the other kind of key thing to say here is that, remember a decade ago when the target was 80% reduction by 2050, now it's net zero,
yeah.
There's a direction of travel here soon, particularly for developed economies that are responsible for the lion's share of historical emissions. It's just not going to be acceptable anymore to be anything other than negative emissions, right? That's the direction of travel. Plus, we have to build, 2 or 3 times our global energy infrastructure to meet rising global demand. So there is a huge amount of work to go around here. It's not really an either-or thing.
Yeah, I agree. It's not an either-or thing. And,
yeah.
I think some of the numbers that you used are even light. Mark Carney talks about $4 or $5 trillion every year starting now.
Right.
It is a massive scale.
There's plenty of work here.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And just a reminder, too, if you want to jump in and ask a question, just head into Slido and submit your question in there. Dan, I'm intrigued to get your take on the scale of the challenge and how surmountable or insurmountable it appears from your vantage point.
Yeah, so maybe repeating a little bit, but kind of my framing on it. We're moving from a world where our energy system runs on fossil fuels today to one that runs on clean electrons in the future. It's a transition that's going to happen over time. It's not going to happen overnight. But we've said that the destination is net zero, varying timeframes. Here in Canada, I think the most ambitious net zero target we've set is a net zero electricity grid by 2035. That's only 12 years away.
Yeah.
And in the world of developing large-scale infrastructure projects, that's not a very long time. Do I think it's possible? Yes, but we need to be doing a lot more than we're doing. The physical infrastructure that we have, the grid that we rely on, physically cannot accommodate all the new electricity demand that we're talking about, from renewable energy injecting into the grid to buildings, industrial heat, all the hydrogen. This is it's a mind-blowing amount of electricity that we're talking about, and I think there is a disconnect in general between the government ambition that's been put out there and what's actually going to be required to make it happen.
And I want to step into that disconnect if we can, because I feel like we're uniquely blessed with this mix of panelists to be able to talk about this. What are the step changes, the fundamental shifts? Where does the ingenuity need to be focused to be able to realise and close that disconnect or close that gap, or whatever we want to describe it as? I'd be intrigued for each of your views on, what are the things that gives you optimism, but you say this is where we need bright brains coming together to solve problems and challenges or innovate and think differently. Kirsty, I might come to you first.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
Well, one of the things that I think is linked to both what you just said and what Dan said is, the recognition that, really what the clean energy transition is going to entail is building a lot of new infrastructure. And that's really difficult, especially for associated infrastructure like transmission and charging stations and everything that really sort of support the new system coming into being. That's one of the reasons why we're really focused on repurposing existing infrastructure as much as possible. And, coal plants or existing thermal plants are a great example where they already have, obviously, grid connections and they have workforce, communities around them. And if we can, switch out the coal boiler, with a new advanced heat source and then continue using the majority of the existing plant, that's a significant cost saving. And, I'll give you, it's very interesting the kind of reaction we're getting from investors around this idea right now, because, there's a perception that the existing coal plants are like polluting liabilities. And we just saw one 1,200 megawatt plant being sold for $1 in the US. Now, with our system, we'd expect that the cost of repowering an existing coal plant would be about $1 billion for a 500 megawatt plant. So, that plant could have been worth, like $2,000 or $3,000 a kilowatt once it's been repowered. And if you then start to look at utilities that have whole fleets of coal plants, this starts to become a really interesting investment opportunity to convert basically polluting liabilities into incredibly valuable sort of jewels of the future electricity system with all of the grid connections that they need so that they can continue operating for decades more. So, we convert not only the challenge of how to build all that infrastructure actually into a kind of golden investment opportunity.
Ashish, how about for you?
I'll give you an example of, interesting example of creativity in solving this problem.
Great.
So a few years ago, cobalt, which is a critical material used in batteries, used to have a very high proportion in batteries. And we had a problem there because a lot of the cobalt mining is in Congo. And if you are an ESG-friendly company or an ESG-friendly investor, it's difficult to kind of justify taking all that cobalt out of Congo and putting it in the batteries, right? But the industry has moved to a new technological pathway where they're using much less cobalt in the same battery today and using much higher amounts of nickel and other materials. That is helping them to de-risk from the supply chain, but also at the same time helping to raise the energy density of the batteries. So I think there are huge amounts of creativity on the technology side coming in. But I'd say one other thing. I don't think there's a significant amount of creativity coming in on energy market regulation and policy making. Traditionally, energy markets have tried to optimize for one variable, which is cost. And as an engineer, I'll tell you that when you're running a model or a simulation to optimize for one variable, it's relatively easy. Today, you have to optimize for at least 3, if not more. Cost, emissions, reliability. And as Bruno said, markets might not take us there, right? I agree with that, but only partially. What we need to do is need to have a very clear look at market design. And the traditional market design, which used to work 5, 10 years ago in Europe, for example, in gas markets in Europe and power markets in Europe, it's not going to work anymore. So I think we need to do a lot more work there, apart from all the technology.
Really good shout on the policy and regulation piece. Dan, for you?
I'm just looking at the screen here. I see a question I think kind of relevant. So the question
Jump in.
Can we move away from long-term PPAs to get renewables financed? I think that brings up the topic of some financing innovation.
Please.
If you really boil down a renewable energy project, they're actually pretty boring. Like it's a big infrastructure project that generates relatively thin returns. That's very well suited for infrastructure or pension fund investors like Evan, AIMCo, and lots of others. But that really requires the renewable generators to enter into a long-term offtake arrangement, usually for 10, 15, 20, maybe even longer. And that really locks in the economics of the project. And that's valuable to unlock pools of capital like pension fund capital. But I think there's pools of capital that are looking for higher returns. And I think there's a lot of potential in taking more merchant exposure, shorter contracting, and if you look at oil and gas, you don't drill an oil and gas well and lock in your product, the sale of your product for 20 years. Like it's a lot of friction in terms of getting these deals to happen quickly, and I think that's...
There's 2 of you that want to jump in here. Ashish, you go first, and I'll come to Evan.
People like us hate merchant power risk, right?
I'm aware, yeah.
And because we're taking a risk for our clients. But there is a solution, and that's concessionary capital. Governments can take that risk for us or help cover it. And there are real conversations going on with the Government of Canada in particular and the Canada Infrastructure Bank around exactly that. And I think that's another bridge it looks like you want to respond. Another bridge
No,
to do that.
I agree. I agree with all that.
You want to say something?
Ashish, you jump in, and then I want to come to Evan for his game changer.
I just steal both of their thoughts and summarize it by saying, boring should be the new exciting. And I say that because it's great to hear that renewable energy is starting to get boring. When I started in this industry 20 years ago, clean tech was a very exciting thing, right? Venture capital and private equity money was chasing this industry. But this industry become boring should be the new benchmark. It should be like infrastructure. There should be pension fund, infrastructure fund, sovereign wealth funds in this industry.
I think we should strive for boring. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
Yep. All right, Evan, I want to come to you. What do you think is the step change?
Step change. Well, I think about this in terms of molecules and electrons. We want to go from using molecules to using electrons. Or we want to use different kinds of molecules, which is what you're talking about. Technology can affect all of that on the supply side and also on the demand side. And demand management, which is this great green idea, is what we're talking about is another solution. And frankly, we need all of them. We need all of them. So again, attending to how people use molecules or electrons and using them more efficiently on the demand side or through technology is going to be a big part of how we.
All right, I want to come to some of these great audience questions. Thank you for everyone who's engaging in Slido. So top question, how do you deal with the net zero problem of measuring, monitoring, verifying offsets to ensure they're actually, very much stressed, reducing emissions? Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to go. I mean, this is, for investors, this question of transparency and measurement is actually key. There is not a good agreement on the taxonomy of this. And there's frankly a lot of greenwashing going on. And the SEC, in particular the Securities Exchange Commission in the US, has come down on that. Now, happily, there are a bunch of people working a little too, frankly, slowly. But this is what happens at international tables, to achieve some standards of disclosure. And from that, we can actually hold people to account and actually reduce emissions. So there is actually good work going on that. It just takes a long time. The ISSB is, of course, one such body.
Ashish, did you
Let
want
me
to
throw in some numbers here to put context on this issue of offsets.
go for it?
Carbon markets are a $1 trillion market already. But voluntary carbon markets, where offsets are used, are only $1.5 billion.
Wow.
Most of the trading in the carbon markets is currently happening in compliance markets, particularly the EU emissions trading scheme, California, RGGI on the east coast of the US, and so on. The problems that carbon market, particularly the voluntary carbon market, is facing today, you hear terms like additionality, measurability, vintage of offsets. I used to hear the same terms 15 years ago when I first started looking at carbon markets. So I totally agree, right? We have not probably reached a level of consensus on standards that we need, but I see progress being made. So I hope these markets will go from $1.5 billion in value to multiple billion dollars of value pretty soon.
Kirsty, one for you next. And I love when people ask these questions, because as I said from the get-go, we never like to assume knowledge here. It's a very safe environment to ask and lean in. So Usman, thank you for doing that. What does it mean exactly to repower a coal plant?
Oh, that's such a great question. Wow, I should really have explained that. So it actually could mean a bunch of things. So, Bill Gates' company, TerraPower, in a joint venture with GE Hitachi, is kind of repowering a coal plant already right now in Wyoming, where they're building a new advanced nuclear plant, basically kind of co-located with an old retiring coal plant. And so there's really good opportunities to repurpose the existing transmission and also to bring some of that workforce in to, to be at that new plant. So that's very popular. There's huge demand for it. But what we mean by repowering a coal plant is actually taking, stopping using the coal boiler and replacing the source of heat with a new advanced heat source. Now, that could be a light water small modular reactor. They're available pretty much today, so we could start repowering coal plants in, as soon as 2025. Or the higher temperature advanced heat sources that are coming to market, like terrestrial energy, for example, here in Canada is a great example. They could actually supply the steam to match the steam conditions at the existing coal plant, and that would be awesome because that would mean that you could actually have your new heat source co-located with the existing coal plant, supply the heat into a thermal energy storage system, which then supplies into the steam to the existing power island. Now, that means that you have a great deal of savings because you're continuing to use the existing coal plant, power plant. But it also means that because of the thermal energy storage, you have a flexible, dispatchable, emissions-free power plant, which will have a very high capacity factor, making it really profitable. And I would say that, you know, the Loan Programs Office in the United States, through the new IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has just been awarded $250 billion to do these kinds of projects. And that money needs to be committed, you know, within 4 years by the end of 2026. Now, that doesn't mean that the coal plant owners have to be ready to start building, but they need to be making their investment decisions. And so, you know, there's a huge opportunity here for, you know, investment, for institutional investors to establish dedicated funds for these kinds of projects. You know, this would be 250 billion. It would cost about $1 billion to repower a 500 megawatt coal plant. So that's 250 projects just in the United States alone.
Huge.
That you could have committed in the next 4 years. That is huge.
Enormous. And this picks up on some questions that are coming through. I'm going to tie together a few themes in our questions here that are around the role of government. So there's a question here, in Canada, there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between government targets and the amount of new generation investment. There was also a question a moment ago around, you know, views on US versus Canadian approach around incentivising and encouraging investment at this moment in time. Evan, I might come to you first on that, but I'd welcome any of the panel's views.
Yeah, you summarized. The Inflation Reduction Act is a big part of what people are enthusiastic about in the US. I mean, it's a huge amount of money, $250 billion. Take that number divided by 10, and it's your Canadian number, roughly. Federal government has talked about a $15 billion growth fund, and the infrastructure bank is, I think, $5 billion. So that pool of capital, 20 roughly, compared to 250 is roughly comparable. And the federal government has taken an approach that they will take first loss or concessionary capital, and they're consulting now on how to do that. So that's a bit of a difference. I'll say this about government, having spent a little time in government. I don't think people in the economy, those of us who work in this business, and many of you, you know, I don't think we wait for government to figure this out. You know, we're muddling through it a bit on our own. But markets are still best allocators of labor and capital. And you know, governments can help constrain market failures and things like that. But I don't think we need to wait for government to invest in the sector, and clearly we're not.
Anyone else to add in on government? Go, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, so talking about our own experience at Greengate, we've been developing renewable energy projects primarily here in Alberta for 15 years. And over our history, we've received $0 of federal government money into our projects, just to put that into perspective. I think the government, personally, I believe the government needs to be doing more in the area of renewables. I think Canada is way behind the US in terms of our package of incentives that we have available for renewables. I'll give you an example. We have a 50% investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage. And we only have a 30% investment tax credit for energy storage, nothing for renewables, and the US does. So, you know, despite, you know, a lot of really good messaging that's coming out of Canada, which I support, that we're moving to net zero and that climate's really an important priority, I'm not seeing it backed up by sufficient action, in my opinion.
Ashish, I might take it in a different direction with you. I know you're very much got your finger on the pulse of what's happening in emerging markets. Can you talk to us a little bit about who you're watching in that regard, in terms of some of the more emerging economies and the different way they're thinking about incentives and renewables?
First thing I'd say, a lot of good discussion today morning and the afternoon about the pain that is being felt in emerging economies. I spent 17 years working in Asia before moving to Houston last year. That is absolutely true. A LNG cargo, which used to cost tens of millions of dollars each cargo, is costing hundreds of millions of dollars today. Countries not only like Pakistan, but Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even India, find it difficult to kind of absorb those kinds of prices. But what that is doing is something interesting in those economies. In India, for example, or even markets like Indonesia, we are starting to see large conglomerates and businesses, family-owned businesses, which have significant share of the GDP, actually come very strongly behind renewable energy, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, all kinds of new energy technologies. And I think that's a really, really good sign. Companies in India, for example, have said they want to achieve $1 a kg production cost for hydrogen within the next 10 years. And they think it is possible because India is one of the lowest cost destinations for renewable power generation today. So I'm seeing a lot of progress in those markets, which is very heartening to see. And I think what governments are trying to do there is also trying to de-risk from all these expensive energy imports that they're reliant on, and are starting to see for the first time ever clean energy and clean power as homegrown sources of energy, which can actually help energy security.
Kirsty, different take for you. You've worked as an advisor to a number of governments, including 10 Downing Street. What's your take at the moment on the role government have to play at this critical juncture, where it feels like we really need to be thinking about how everything incentivises, greater investment in our energy transition?
I just have to check to see whether we have a government at the moment in the UK. I think my colleagues in Europe are watching the movements recently in the United States, with a great deal of concern, because actually, what the US government is doing is, somebody described it as creating a giant green petrol station to supply the world, because they're creating such incredible incentives, $3 a kilogram for hydrogen, for the next 10 years. They're just going to bring all of the supply chain, all of the capability, and build all this industrial capability. And that, it really is the role of governments. It's to enable the innovation and the investment in those supply chains, and then they will be strengthened to persist. So we do need to see governments do that. We need to see governments to do much more on demand side measures as well. In Europe right now, we're obviously experiencing a absolutely horrific energy crisis. This winter is going to be really tough, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on politicians and governments to do more. But I think it's also really exposed the dependence, the folly of the overdependence on gas at the heart of the clean energy transition strategies. And energy security and affordability are going to be seen as being as important as decarbonization. And I think, as you said, really understanding those drivers and designing for them is going to be really important, and we do need governments to provide leadership on that.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of territory in this conversation, and it's rapidly drawing to a close. So I'd love to turn to each of you and just ask what you'd love our audience to leave with as a takeaway. If they take nothing else from this conversation, what's the key nugget you'd love them to go away and ruminate on, think about, start a conversation around? Evan, I'll come to you first.
It's urgent. We're running out of time. We really are running out of time. And the amount of money that's needed is staggering. We think there's a great investment opportunity in it, so that's why we're spending time on it, but we can't do this all soon enough.
Appreciate the urgency. I'm hearing loud and clear on that. Dan, how about for you?
I think energy transition is something that we urgently need to do, but it's also the greatest commercial opportunity of our lifetimes, of our generation. And I think we need to be doing more quickly, but there's lots of bright minds around the world that are being applied to this, and I'm hopeful.
Lean in. If you've got a bright mind, sign up to be a part of solving these problems. That's what I hear there. Ashish?
Last year, I wrote a blog with a few of my colleagues where I think we said, let's not pretend that the transition is going to be orderly.
Going to be what, sorry?
Let's not pretend that the energy transition is going to be an orderly transition, right? We will face a lot of volatility in markets across the world, right? But as we progress on the path to the energy transition, the creativity that we bring in on the technology side, coupled with the creativity on policy making and business model, would probably reduce this volatility as we go along, right? So you'd see a lot of disruption in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think once the solution set is relatively clear, you probably double down on things that you can really scale up. And then the pathway from there should look much better.
It's a very encouraging outlook. Kirsty, bring us home.
I think the urgency is increasing. I mean, the developing economies, the emerging economies that are already exposed to very serious climate impacts need to build their energy systems to increase their resilience to deal with these shocks and difficulties. And it's going to become like a lot of pressure to decarbonize quickly, the more that we see these impacts affecting everybody. We've heat waves and storms and droughts and so on. So I would anticipate that even in 5 years from now, there's going to be a great deal more urgency and demand for solutions. And one of the things that we're doing is getting ready for that, and bringing new diverse technologies into the mix, which can be deployed really rapidly and at scale, and address many of the really tough to decarbonize sectors that we don't have good answers for right now to complement wind and solar. But also designing for constraints. And I would just finish by saying, cost and speed and scale and spatial requirements and supply chains and sustainability, right? Those are the kind of principles we need to be organizing around. And nuclear energy is increasingly being recognized through ECG funds as being sustainable.
Absolutely. What a fantastic discussion. Can you join me in thanking Evan, Dan, Ashish, and Kirsty? Thank you all so much.